The sound seminar you're about to hear was recorded at the Poetry Center of the New York YWHA on December 9th, 1963. This program presents Walter Kaufmann lecturing on Aeschylus and the Death of Tragedy. A fuller commentary on this subject may be obtained by reading Mr. Kaufmann's book, Tragedy and Philosophy, published by Doubleday and Company.
Tonight, I want to speak on Aeschylus and the death of tragedy. The topic tonight is meant to sound somewhat paradoxical. It would be more nearly the usual sort of thing to speak about Aeschylus and the birth of tragedy. Aeschylus is usually considered the man who created tragedy. And even if one suggests, as I have done, that perhaps that honor should be divided between Aeschylus and Sophocles, and even if one should agree that there are senses in which it was only Sophocles who created tragedy as we know it, as a single self-sufficient tragic play, it still seems unusual to link Aeschylus with the death of tragedy. But I think by the time I finish my lecture, you will see what I mean. To begin with a very brief remarks about Aeschylus, the traditional dates for him are 525 to 456, but the first of these dates, unlike the second, is questionable. It was presumably arrived at by calculating back 40 years approximately from Aeschylus' first victory. The first time he won in the tragic contests was 484, and the Greeks arbitrarily assumed that a man flourished at the age of 40. So some people think that perhaps he was born later because they think it is unlikely that a man who then triumphed as often as Aeschylus did should not have triumphed until the age of 40. So he may have been born later than 525. In any case, it is supposed that the first actor who conversed with the chorus was introduced by Thespis about 534. Scholars follow Aristotle in saying that it was Aeschylus who introduced the second actor, and it was probably also he who first created trilogies, or if we count the satyr play as the fourth part, tetralogies. And Aeschylus later accepted the third actor from Sophocles, which means not that the total cast comes in the earlier plays to 2 actors and the later ones to 3 actors, but rather that 3 actors with speaking parts could be on the stage at one time. There are often more than that, but they usually don't have speaking parts. And we shall see today how when Aeschylus borrowed the third actor from Sophocles, took over this innovation, he put it to somewhat astonishing new uses. We know the titles of about 79 of his plays, and 7 of them have survived. Of Aeschylus' life, in addition to the foregoing, we know little. We do know that he fought in the year 490 at Marathon, after the Delphic oracle had counseled the Greeks to lie low and accept Persian rule. He was one of the approximately 10,000 Athenians plus 1,000 men from Plataea who fought. And 6,000 of them, 6,000 of the 10 or 11,000 Greeks were killed in that battle, one of them Aeschylus' brother. He may also have fought at Salamis in 480 and at Plataea in 479. That we do not know. But we do know that he died in Sicily, and it is supposed that the epitaph on his tombstone, and the epitaph has survived, was due to Aeschylus himself. And one thing that is striking about it is that it mentions that he fought at Marathon, but does not mention that he wrote tragedies. And what this suggests to me is that having fought at Marathon is something in which he took the utmost pride. And if I try to understand why, I suppose that perhaps the fact that the oracle had counseled against it, and that the vast majority of the Greeks obeyed the oracle and did not fight, and that he was one of the few who followed the dictates of their own reason and conscience and went out and vanquished the power that was the heir of the ages, vanquished the power that had succeeded to the empire of immemorial Assyrians and Babylonians and now Persians, that this seemed to him very possibly a paradigm of the human condition and what man can do in that condition, that he need not bow low to power and authority and tradition, but that by relying on his own reason and conscience, he may triumph. Of the plays of his that we have, scholars used to be unanimous in supposing that the suppliant women, or sometimes called more briefly the suppliants, was the first. It certainly is the most archaic. Some manuscript lists of plays performed that have recently come to light lead some people now to suppose that it's very late. I should still think, from all the internal evidence, that it probably was the first of his plays, possibly even earlier than 484, when he celebrated his first victory. Of those that we have, the next may have been the Prometheus, which some scholars date 475 and some much later. The Persians is authoritatively dated 472. And then in 468, Sophocles defeated Aeschylus for the first time. The Aeschylus family took its revenge for that in a curious way. In the year when Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Tyrannus, was first performed, 425, Aeschylus' sister's son, Philocles, won first prize. And Sophocles, with the Oedipus Rex, took second prize. As I told you, he never won third prize. It was always first or second, and the Oedipus one was one with which he didn't place first. Why this was, we don't know. It's, of course, just possible that the other plays that were performed along with it had not got quite the attention they deserved from Sophocles, because conceivably he concentrated on his masterpiece, and the others may have been, I don't know, somewhat slipshod. In any case, in the Aeschylus family, the tragic genius ran somewhat as the musical genius ran in the Bach family. Not only his nephew Philocles won some first prizes, but Philocles' son and Philocles' grandson also were prominent tragic poets. Of the remaining plays of Aeschylus, there are the Seven Against Thebes, dated 467, and then the Oresteia, 3 plays, 458, and then in 456 he died. Let me now talk in some detail, first of all, about the Oresteia, and then much more briefly later about the 4 other plays. And perhaps the best way of introducing my remarks about the Oresteia is to cite the British poet Swinburne, who called the Oresteia perhaps the greatest achievement of the human mind. Well, I don't identify myself with quite that sentiment. It is always interesting to know what great poets have thought of the work of other great poets, and probably the Oresteia is pretty safe of inclusion in any list of the greatest literary works of all time. Here again, as in the case of Oedipus, we have material that was used both before and after the play or the series of plays we want to consider. After Aeschylus, Euripides dealt with some of the same material in his Electra, 413. Sophocles wrote an Electra play, of which scholars don't agree as to whether it's earlier or later. I should think it's later, but I can't prove that. Euripides returned to the same theme in a play on Orestes, 408. He wrote an Iphigenia in Aules, which was one of the last things he wrote, and Euripides also wrote an Iphigenia in Tauris. Much, much later, Racine wrote a play on Iphigenia in Aules, Voltaire wrote an Orestes, Goethe an Iphigenia, and in our own time, Jean-Paul Sartre, Les Mouches, The Flies, deals with the same story again. Time forbids to make any comparisons between Aeschylus' treatment and the treatments that came after him, but time doesn't forbid saying very, very briefly something about the shape in which Aeschylus found the story. That seems always important to me, because without that one can't quite appreciate what's original, what's new, what he felt he had to say when he picked up this material. Now, just as in the case of the Oedipus story, we find some references in the Iliad and some in the Odyssey. Indeed, in the Iliad, some of the material is mentioned right in the beginning in a scene, the first scene, which strikes, I think, most readers, not only Robert Graves, who has given a translation in this spirit, as quite irreverent, and which I refer to briefly by way of suggesting how far Agamemnon was from having the stature that he is built up to in the Oresteia. It so happens that in the first reference, Clytemnestra herself is mentioned too. And why did I refuse, says Agamemnon? Because I chose to keep the girl and take her home. Indeed, I like her better than my consort Clytemnestra. And then, roughly a page later, Achilles, the great runner, gave him, Agamemnon, a black look. "You shameless schemer," he cried, "always aiming at profitable deals." And then, "The truth is that we joined the expedition to please you. Yes, you unconscionable cur, to get satisfaction from the Trojans for Menelaus and yourself, a fact which you utterly ignore." And many of you will recall that Achilles has a good mind to kill Agamemnon right then and there, in which case we shouldn't have any Oresteia. And Pallas Athene controls him barely and says, "Come now, give up this strife and take your hand from your sword, sting him with words instead." And this Achilles, like a good Greek, enjoys doing. And he rounded on Atrides once again with bitter taunts. "You drunken sot," he cried, "with the eyes of a dog and the courage of a doe. You never have the pluck to arm yourself and go into battle with the men, or to join the other captains in an ambush. You would sooner die." The only point of quoting this is to suggest how totally un-Aeschylean, how totally unlike the atmosphere of the Oresteia the spirit of this scene is, in which, for the first time in world literature, we get introduced to the name of Clytemnestra and to the figure of Agamemnon. Now, if we turn to the Odyssey, to be sure, there are more detailed references to the particular material that comes up in the Oresteia. The first one is that we're told right at the outset of the Odyssey that Aegisthus was warned by the gods, but stole Agamemnon's wife nevertheless, in spite of the gods' warning, and murdered Agamemnon, and got what he deserved when Orestes came back and killed him. He has only himself to blame, and he deserves no tears at all. This is the way the theme is introduced in the Odyssey. And then in the second reference to the story, Telemachus is told that he should become as brave as Orestes, who made a great name for himself by killing Aegisthus. The role of Clytemnestra in the several references to this story in the Odyssey is always utterly subordinate. She is not an important person, let alone such a superhuman figure as she turns out to be in the Oresteia. Perhaps one very short passage will tell volumes in a few words. The foul crime, we read in the Odyssey, in the third book, the third canto, the foul crime was planned and carried out in Argos by Aegisthus. And then 7 long years, with Agamemnon dead, he held the people down before the vengeance. But in the 8th year, Orestes killed the snake who killed his father. He gave his hateful mother and her soft man a tomb together and proclaimed the funeral day a feastal day for all the Argive people. There are further references to the slaughter of Agamemnon and his men. He is killed not alone, but he is killed having been tricked by Aegisthus to a great banquet meal, together with all his men. He is killed like an ox at the trough, and Agamemnon in the underworld is still surrounded by the many men who were killed together with him. So in sum, Clytemnestra has nothing like the stature she has in the Oresteia. Agamemnon was killed with many others. What was at work was treachery, nothing of justice. Orestes' vengeance is something totally unproblematic, indeed a wonderful thing, held up more than once as a good example for Telemachus. The murder of his mother is sort of not stressed. The murder of Aegisthus is stressed, and under the circumstances, of course, there is no whiff even of Furies. Now let us turn to the way that Aeschylus deals with this material. Let us begin by talking briefly about the plot and the characters in Aeschylus' Oresteia. The first thing to note about it is that this is genuinely and importantly a trilogy and not a tragedy. This is not a mistake, I think, that people generally make, thinking of it as a tragedy, but as we shall see shortly, many people, I think, make the mistake of thinking of it as 3 tragedies, as if it were 3 tragedies in the modern sense that somehow were related to each other and performed even on the same day originally. And then some odd questions come up about whether the Eumenides, the last of the 3, which does not end tragically, which does not end sadly, is a tragedy, and what follows from that. It's not 2 tragedies and 1 non-tragedy. It's a trilogy. Now, if we turn at these and ask ourselves, is the Agamemnon, or the second one, the Koephoroi, or the Eumenides, or is the whole something that's rather like the Oedipus Rex, or like the Antigone? The answer is no. It is something unprecedented, and similarly, the sort of thing that Sophocles did was also something unprecedented. I have last time proposed a reading of Sophocles' first Oedipus play, and I found in it a particular experience of life. Some of you may conceivably have wondered, not that anybody accused me of this, whether I a little bit read my own ideas into it. In that case, you will find tonight that I am very far from reading the same experience of life that I find in the Oedipus Tyrannus into the Oresteia, or indeed into any of Aeschylus' plays. I find here a totally different experience of life. As we look at the characters, each one of these 3 plays that constitute the trilogy has first of all a chorus. In the first one, it's the chorus of elders, in the second one, a chorus of women, and in the third one, the chorus of the Eumenides. Then each one has 2 figures, 2 personae, of whom I think we can reasonably say without fear of contradiction that they are minor roles. In the first play, they are the watchman and the herald. In the second one, Pylades and the nurse. And in the last one, Hermes and a priestess. And that leaves in each of these 3 plays 4 major figures. It's very interesting, I think, to note the symmetry in each a chorus, in each two minor figures, in each four major figures. In the first one, the major figures are, I think, unquestionably Clytemnestra, Aegisthus, Agamemnon, and Cassandra. In the second one, they are still Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, but the place of Agamemnon and Cassandra has been taken by Orestes and Electra. And in the last one, there's again an overlap of two being kept. It's the ghost of Clytemnestra now, and Orestes is still there. And the remaining male and female role are now assigned to Apollo and Athene. It turns out then that there is only one character that runs through the whole trilogy, and that is Clytemnestra. She appears bodily, as it were, in the first and the second play, while in the last one, there's only the ghost of Clytemnestra. Now, there's a change in the conception of some of these people. Perhaps the best way of bringing this out is by saying that if we look first of all at the subordinate people, we can surely say the nurse is not an individual, is not some particular nurse, but the nurse is just plain a nurse. And the herald is just plain a herald. That is their function, and their function in this sense exhausts them. But this seems to me in a way also to be true of the main figures. There is a sense in which Clytemnestra is Clytemnestra and Orestes is Orestes, and whatever is irrelevant to the main line of the story as conceived by Aeschylus has no part in it at all. Now, who changes? Agamemnon changes. Not before us on the stage, but before and after the murder. The point that I'm about to make is perhaps one that is fresh in all our minds, because something like that has happened in the United States during the last 3 weeks. Agamemnon, in the first half, you might say, of the Agamemnon play, is a man of whom H.D. Kitto has been able to say, reasonably and correctly, I think, that he is not a tragic hero as Aristotle would have him, who has some hamartia, who has some flaw, but that he is practically all hamartia. He is so full of flaws. What is stressed, what is harped on, and all the speeches that we hear about him are his shortcomings. And just when you might be ready to say, well, this of course is because we hear Clytemnestra speaking about him, he himself appears and certainly does not improve the impression. Not only is he callous, and you might say that's a modern feeling about it, about the way he brings Cassandra, callous both toward Cassandra and callous toward Clytemnestra's feelings. But then he says to Clytemnestra several times over that under no circumstances will he give in and walk over the crimson or purple tapestry. And then after having said that this is a matter of his pride on which he will under no circumstances give way, he does give way, thus illustrating just once more what we had indeed been led to respect, that he has a great weakness of character. But then once he is dead, there's a sudden transformation. All the hamartia vanishes. He is no longer this human being that people knew, that people encountered, who had his great sides, but who also had perhaps some weaknesses, perhaps even great weaknesses, but he is suddenly the fallen king. And with that, we have a totally different atmosphere. Previously, his conquest of Troy was, to put it very mildly, a problematic matter. Perhaps that is putting it too mildly. We were given to understand that this was something that was brutal and cruel, and that a city is something terrible. But as soon as he is dead, we get a totally different perspective. Nothing now extenuates the crime of having killed the king. The other character who seems to me to change somewhat is Apollo. Apollo, of course, does not bodily appear except in the last of the three plays, but we hear something about his conduct in the first play. He is the one who is to be blamed for Cassandra's terrible fate, and I shall not go into details about it now, by any standards by which we today would judge it, or by which Aeschylus, as we see his moral judgments, would judge him. Apollo's conduct was shameful. And then when we come to the Eumenides, Apollo's conduct still does not compare with that of Pallas Athena, but still he has matured. The god, you might say, has developed rather nicely. He is still autocratic, but if we look at it a little differently now and say, has there been some change in the conception of the divine through this trilogy? There's no question about that at all. This change is fully explicit in Athena, who is inseparable from Athens. And what is suggested to us is that when we come to Athens, to this great city, well, there's an altogether new outlook, a different atmosphere, one that is worlds removed from that of the Agamemnon or even the Coephori, and this new community of people in Athens goes with a new theology and a new experience of life. One way of still further making explicit the development here is to say that neither the whole trilogy nor even any one of the three plays has a single hero. The only one of the three of which one might even be tempted to say that it has a single hero is the central one, the Coephoroi, where you might say Orestes is the hero. Clearly, the last play doesn't have any conceivable hero. It's named the Eumenides, but you could hardly say that the Eumenides are collectively the hero. And in the first one, though it's named Agamemnon, he clearly isn't the hero. He is rather passive. But is Clytemnestra the hero? It seems the wrong question altogether. If then we ask what really is it that develops, it seems odd perhaps, and seems to me imperfect to put the matter the way I have put it now, and it seems rather better to say that there is a development of the whole atmosphere. How can we articulate this atmosphere? In the Agamemnon, we encounter a uniquely sustained fusion of majesty, terror, passion, in a world that is dominated by pride and vengeance and excess. There is no innocent suffering in the Agamemnon. There is no innocence, but punishment notoriously exceeds the deed at least doubly. Troy was punished by means of Agamemnon and Menelaus and the Greeks, and now they have been punished in a terrible naval disaster which is described for us, and Agamemnon is punished before us. Iphigenia in the remote background, whose sacrifice is mentioned, might have been innocent, but that was off stage long ago, and this question is ignored. Cassandra is punished terribly for what seems a minor failing, and the implication is that Clytemnestra and Aegisthus will be punished by Orestes, and if one thinks that far ahead, assumes that Orestes too will have to be punished. In the second play, in the Coephori, there's a significant change in the atmosphere. The two characters, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, who carry over, are not changed, but the atmosphere is changed. We are in a different world. Orestes and Electra try quite consciously to avoid excess, and they seek purity. In place of personal vengeance that demands satisfaction redoubled and more, what they strive for is the exact execution of the divine command and no more. And together with this trimming of pride and this trimming of passion, I find, as a reader, there's also a trimming of majesty. Perhaps the terror is not really meant to be abated, but certainly the second play seems less terrifying than the first one, as mystery gradually gives way to clarity and to articulate reflection on what exactly one is doing, and rationality. In the first play, in the Agamemnon, we get in hair-raising speeches descriptions of the Holocaust of Troy, of the drowning of the fleet, of the slaughter of Iphigenia. We get the terror of Cassandra on the stage, and then in the second play, we get a relatively rational, reasonable, moderate execution of two criminals, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. To be sure, there's still some terror. In the end, Orestes is pursued by the Furies. In the Eumenides, which means, of course, the same thing that I've just called Furies, we almost leave the dark world of myth and irrationality, at least in the second part, which is set in Athens, and now reason and the careful weighing of pros and cons take the place of tragedy. The original audience, to be sure, had a more harassing experience than we have in reading the play. We are told that they were shocked by the daring of Aeschylus, who brought the Erinyes, the unreconciled humanities, on the stage in the beginning. And we may expect that the music and the dances that he composed for that scene must have been terrifying. The modern reader is more likely to find the last 150 lines, roughly, of the play, the blessings and blessings upon blessings on Athens, a little harder to take than the Erinyes in the beginning. But perhaps what one should imagine here is music of the order of Handel's Hallelujah Chorus or something like Bach, probably something that was sublime, and probably the audience had a sense of having earned it by having sat through the terrible horrors of the first two plays. There is no hero now. It clearly is not Orestes. In fact, Orestes as a human being, and this is an important point to stress about Aeschylus, is really not of the slightest interest whatsoever. To ask what he will do now after the end of the trilogy, whether he will marry, whether he will live happily ever after, or what he will do or not do, is simply irrelevant. And so, in retrospect, were the early married life of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, or the details of the relationship between Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, or the details of the relationship between Agamemnon and Cassandra, or for that matter, the youth of Electra and Orestes. None of this is of the slightest interest to Aeschylus, and even to ask this question somehow is plainly an anachronism. This doesn't belong here. It isn't that kind of a story. There is no interest in individuals. Incidentally, classical scholars have noted that it is only with Sophocles that characters, when they come on the stage and find somebody else, take notice of each other and greet each other. For Aeschylus, they do not matter as individuals. But what matters is neither the individuals, nor even the events or the action or the details of the plot, but something about the human situation. To be specific, understanding it and acting accordingly. I think it is quite literally true that this trilogy is immensely philosophical. Twice, in the first chorus in the Agamemnon, lines 176 following and 250 following, we are told that wisdom comes through suffering. If then, with our modern eyes, we look at the plays, we find that not a single individual is shown to learn anything through suffering. But humanity did, especially Athens did. And that's what the plays are about. What humanity, and particularly Athens, should have learned through terrible suffering. And in the process, not only humanity learns something, but the gods are humanized and moralized. Resentment is harnessed, passion is conquered by reason, and poetry gradually turns into philosophy, which some of you may possibly consider an overstatement, in which case you can read the Eumenides once more and see whether that is not just what happens in the latter part of the Eumenides, that we now get not passionate action, but careful discussion of the pros and cons, of what is for and what is against. But just this kind of a philosophical attitude is usually associated with the death of tragedy. So it's very interesting, if only in a preliminary way at this point, to note that there seems to be something about what happens in Aeschylus that seems to be quite at odds with any tragic vision of the world. Now, before we pursue this theme, let us first read Gilbert Murray's wonderful praise of Aeschylus, which seems to me very well earned. Writes Gilbert Murray, "There's all the difference in the world between a story of adventure and a dramatic poem, between a play by Dumas the Elder and a play by Tolstoy. In the former, you take for granted what a murder is, or let us say, what a lover or a husband is, and you spend your ingenuity in making an exciting story about lovers, husbands, and murders. In the latter, Tolstoy, you take for granted some story and spend your imagination in trying to realize what a murder is, or what it really means to be a husband or lover. In the Oresteia, it is taken as known that Agamemnon conquered Troy, having sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia in order to do so, that his wife Clytemnestra murdered him, and that her son Orestes murdered or executed her and went mad in consequence. The effort of the drama is to make us feel what it is to take a city, to sacrifice a daughter, to hate a husband so much as to kill him, or to feel driven to an act so horrible as the slaying of one's mother." This gives us some idea of what might be great about the Oresteia. But now let us consider the case about the death of tragedy and see how Aeschylus looks if we look at that. Now, there's a book on the death of tragedy by George Steiner, in which the idea is, and I will give you some quotations in a moment, that tragedies should end badly, that people like Goethe and Schiller, who try to have some reconciliation at the end, really didn't write tragedies, that moderns think that innovations of some sort, social engineering, can make tragedies unnecessary, and that if you have that kind of outlook on the world, that then, of course, you cannot have tragedies.